And well, I'm going to ask each of them to say a little bit about themselves and their thoughts on the responsible tech agenda. Very clear that we're talking about how do you put it into practice. So I have teed them up in advance, so I'm hoping they're going to be really up for this with some examples of how this works. But we're not going to spend the next 40 minutes talking to you. We want you to engage with us. So we're really looking for you guys to be asking some really challenging questions of this amazing panel as we've now introduced. So Jeremy, why don't you kick us off with telling us a little bit about your background so these people in the audience know, those who don't already know how wonderful you are, know about the work of Digital Capital.
Oh, I don't know. Right. Digital Catapult is, I like to call it a lab for business, but actually it's a whole bunch of labs for different businesses. We're funded by the government in part, and then we work commercially and do collaborative research and development as well. And our whole kind of goal is really to try and encourage early adoption of some of the more advanced digital tech. And we work with lots and lots of early stage businesses, with scale-ups, and with large companies as well. And we run programs across a range of different technologies that we've identified as being the ones that for the UK are kind of really hot opportunities. So a big program in AI and machine learning, a program in immersive technology, and another one that covers future networks like 5G and low-powered networks and that kind of stuff. And then we do a bit of experimental work in blockchain as well. And most of our focus is on the creative industries and in manufacturing, so which is a kind of interesting kind of pair of bedfellows, but actually there's lots of interesting kind of crossover between them. And my background is, before that, has been being an entrepreneur and building businesses and helping them be sold. And I've done that mostly in the music and technology space. So
brilliant.
Me.
Anab, I absolutely loved your profile. Your profile says you imagine and build future worlds we can experience in the present moment. I cannot wait for you to tell us about this.
That's it. You said it. I'm a designer and a filmmaker and co-founder of a sort of a organization called Superflux. We are designers, filmmakers, artists, technologists, and we think of ourselves as archaeologists of the future. So we visit many possible futures and bring back evidences from those futures for people to experience today, to understand from those fragments and evidences what is the potential of a certain technology and how it sits within society, but also what are the unintended consequences of some of the things we are building today. So a lot of our work gives form and visceral and experiential tangibility to some of the very intangible things, especially technologies that we are working with today.
Great. Veronique, tell us. You're a competitive gamer. I'm a bit worried about you.
So my name is Veronique Lallier. So I'm in charge of marketing at Hi-Rez Studio. Hi-Rez Studio is a developer and publisher on video game, which are free-to-play and competitive, as you said. And basically, our focus is really serving our million of audience that we have on console and computer. And I've been working, in this company for a few years, but I've been part of the gaming industry for 20 years actually now. And my team at Hi-Rez are split over 2 locations, so in Atlanta, Georgia State in America, and also in Brighton here in the UK. And the role of my team is serving all our development team to bring consumer into our games, retain them, and monetize them.
Great. And Ella, tell us about you.
Last but hopefully not least. My name is Ella. I work for a technology studio called Projects by If. We do something that we call sort of practical and ethical uses of data and AI. So we look at really very tangible solutions and ways of approaching some of the ethical challenges that we're discussing here today. We work with a range of organizations, so from sort of internet giants to small and sort of charities and smaller corporations to sort of balance having impact at scale and also being able to not have ethical uses of data be a luxury, right? It's something that should be true for everybody. And really we're fighting for sort of what we like to say, a better information society. And I'm happy that's like to discuss that a little bit further. My background is in a combination of sort of academia, journalism, and tech. And it's great to be just doing one thing at the moment, so.
Brilliant. So, I mean, we all heard the Secretary of State, and I'm sure that's put lots of food for thought in people's minds. I was also quite taken this morning listening to Mark talking about a very different aspect of responsible tech. You know, when I first started thinking about this topic, I was thinking, is responsible tech just a question of data, or you know, or is it a much bigger question than that? We've heard trust also be talked about today, but then Mark was also talking about diversity and what that means. And interestingly, I put a question up on Twitter and said, you know, how would people like to challenge these guys? And one of the questions that came back that actually struck me was from a campaigner from a disability perspective who started talking about actually we've got white goods out there that are, you know, now powered by tech. We've got an Internet of Things, but actually for many disabled people, the technology is not being used for good in that way. So, you know, I just throw those thoughts out there as different ways to think about the responsible tech agenda. And I'm going to ask each of you to perhaps, and we're going to try and do this as a conversation rather than everybody just talking about their own thing. You know, what does responsible tech mean to you? And have you got any really brilliant examples of how of good practice in responsible tech that you'd like to share with the audience? And audience, please be ready. We are going to ask you for some questions, and I want these guys really challenged. Anyone want to kick us off?
I would say that it's probably all of the above, right? And I know that's sort of a cop-out question, but I think you can also have a look at, so, you know, I think most people, the reason I dove in quickly is because I wanted to say Signal, which is a messaging app, which is sort of open source and heavily encrypted, which I think is a brilliant thing and everybody should use. I think there's also, then we can see other areas where companies are trying to be more responsible in what sort of relationships they're designing for. Look at the difference, for example, between Tinder and Bumble, where one, you know, the second one is started by someone who's left Tinder, and where she sort of identified that a lot of women who were on it, heterosexual women that were on it, wanted to have the power to be the first people to respond, not only, you know, and to be able to block men from talking to it. So I think there's a wide range of things.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the video game industry and at Hi-Rez, our main, you know, major consideration around responsible tech is you know, the safe and fair use of data, but also the welfare of our communities. Practical example, things we're doing at Hi-Rez. So because we are a developer that our game are published on third-party platform, we don't collect ourselves, you know, sensitive data. But what we're doing actually is we're looking at cohort of players and how they consume our game, and we iterate on our product to improve them at a cadence between 2 to 4 weeks, depending on where the title is in its life cycle, in order to improve our experience. So basically what we will look at is the pain point where the consumer gets stuck and is not having fun anymore, to actually improve the game and make it fun for them. So I think that's the way we're using data and tech in order to adapt our product to our consumer and not the other way around.
Jeremy, did you want to? Or
Sure. I mean, I suppose the place where we've been most kind of focused around this is in our AI program, where I think, you know, artificial intelligence has thrown up more controversies and more opportunity, but also more paranoia than almost any other tech, and it kind of covers almost everything, and almost every other area of technology is kind of potentially enhanced or impacted by AI. And so we're running a program called the Machine Intelligence Garage, which is focused on early stage deep tech AI companies and really addressing a need that we've found when we went out and talked to a lot of those companies a couple of years back, and who said actually just accessing the technology and accessing advanced compute capability is something we need to be able to do. And so we put a lab together with Google and with Amazon and with Cray and NVIDIA and a bunch of other people to allow people to try out all those different technologies. But we also said, hang on, if you're an early stage business and you're forming your business at the same time, let's think about how we could also help you do that in a responsible way. And so we created a kind of an ethics group In fact, we've got two. There's a sort of ethics steering committee, and then there's an ethics working group. The steering committee's got some amazing people on it, like Jenny Tennyson, who's the CEO of the ODI, and Joe Twist, who's the CEO of UKI, which is the Games Trade Association, and Hayatun Salan, who runs the Royal Academy for Engineering. And it's chaired by an Oxford philosophy professor called Luciano Floridi, who also chairs the Turing Institute's ethics committee. And they've come out with a framework to start off with, which we've kind of published just at the end of last year, which is a whole bunch of questions to have companies ask themselves about, is what we're doing going to lead to unintended consequences, or are we in some way not being as responsible as we should, or how do we make sure that we are? And that covers quite a broad range of things, all the way from the design, content, and thought process in algorithmic design itself, all the way through to what's our business model, and is our business model itself actually going to engender difficult behaviours? Through to how do we deal with people's data? How do we engender trust, and that, a whole range of things. And I think the thing that's been really interesting about it is that we've been able to apply that to the companies that are going through the program. So there's been about 50 companies that have gone through that program so far, and increasingly we're working with them and seeing how that's helping them to think some of this stuff through. So it has to get quite practical quite quickly in order to make a difference, I think, and therefore it gets quite specific as well. So there's one company that I think is doing something really interesting, where their remit was to try and analyse kind of behaviours and footfall in retail, but they didn't want to do that in a way that was going to be invasive of individual or personal privacy, and so there's a lot of closed-circuit TV video footage around that you could tap into, but they took a different approach and said, okay, we're just going to track people's feet, footwear. So this company called Hoxton Analytics have created this system that allows them to track that, because if you think about it, it's incredible what kind of social, demographic, gender information you can get just by looking at people's footwear. Look at ours. So it tells you something. I don't know what it tells you, but they seem to know.
It's quite a good reflection.
Not a bad reflection. So, you can tell there's a sort of corporate presence maybe, and then there's a sort of more of a street kind of thing. And obviously, so, but you don't need to know anything about the people to be able to start to see that you could get some information out of it. So, yeah, that's maybe that. I've probably trivialised hugely what they're doing.
No, I think that's really, it's a good example, and it's very practical, and it kind of gets people's brains thinking about how you do it differently. And Anab, tell us a little bit from your perspective.
I think I'm just on the completely opposite spectrum. So a lot of what's been talked around, which is clearly important, is around applied ethics, and it is something very practical. But quite often what we are doing with organizations is around meta ethics, and really kind of our attempt is to try and really shift the Overton window with people who have the power and influence to who and also the hubris of building these technologies to start with, that there is a general understanding or belief that I'm doing things for good, and whatever good will be. But we know very well that a technology is not how it doesn't turn out how it is originally thought about or how it's marketed, but it is always in the end it's always the users who determine the way the technology is shaped. So Facebook, despite everything, was also used by ISIS militants at borders. They would go into people's Facebook profiles and identify their allegiance to that particular war, and then they were allowed to pass through the border or not. That was not a scenario, I'm sure, that they had thought of. And so the idea is, what is this moral compass we're talking about? What is good? What is bad? Who decides? These are very, very blurry moral boundaries. And I think talking at a meta-ethics level, to understand with those who are considering these technologies, it is not enough to have this. I have an analogy with a kind of a pepper sprinkling, like you have this glitter dust of ethics that you sprinkle over things, and then it's kind of fine, because we'll continue, like we keep talking about AI, and all we are talking about, how do we fix automated decisions. But the fact is that we are accepting the fact that AI is going to be everywhere and things will be automated. And our imagination is so limited by that belief that we must fix the bias. But why, if bias is a social problem, we cannot solve it in technology if we don't think about it as a social construct. So I think we work at that level with organizations, really.
Maybe we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. I mean, it's great to hear the balance between the good and some of the challenges. So look, audience, you now know the panel that you've got here. Let's have some questions. Fantastic. We've got two, so why don't we, yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm interested in particularly in a lot of other areas, so consumer protection, environmental protection, work protection, safety. There was started out as a lot of kind of ethical frameworks, ethical ideas, but that was very voluntary, and eventually organizations end up much more looking at legislation and regulation. It becomes much more of a political campaign to how you get those things in, because we know that at a certain point the voluntary stuff just doesn't get us there. There aren't enough consequences. Rashida alluded to this earlier. How much do you think that legislation and regulation, what part will that play in this?
It's a very topical question this morning, I think. Obviously, there's been some calls from I don't know whether that's what stimulated perhaps the question. For those of you that haven't seen it, there's been the Common Science and Technology Committee have called for Ofcom to be given regulatory responsibility for social media, and also by October, actually, so there's quite a date on that, and also for a statutory duty of care to be established. So I think that's just a bit of framing. Does anybody in the panel particularly want to pick up on that point?
Yeah, I'd love to, actually. I think that regulation is vital. I think self-regulation is important, but it is obviously inadequate and too slow. I also think that the emphasis that we have at the moment, I think, as an industry in the UK on ethical principles and frameworks is laudable in many ways, but it's a little bit like, you know, my research was partially in religious studies, and it's always amusing when I sort of see these ethical principles, and I sort of think, I'm like, but that's a bit like thinking that no individual religious person would ever do wrong because of the 10 Commandments. And it's actually, you know, it's part of why I thought that like Hayden's presentation from Bulb was really powerful this morning, because while these seem like small incremental issues and these sort of fudging of like, oh, you know, but I still need to sell stuff, and I want to do, I think it's very reflective of quite how hard some of those things are.
For me, that was actually really interesting, because it was like, so why do you have to choose between climate and selling our data to Facebook? Why does there have to be a choice?
And I no longer work for Bulb.
No.
I did make some very stylish videos for them, though, so please click on those.
But I think it is interesting, though.
But I think Saul Alinsky, I think, makes a really interesting discussion on that in terms of when he talks about rules for radicals. And I think the question is that, you know, what he says is that it's not that the ends justify the means, but it's which ends justify which means. And also, I think that assuming that we are entirely able to opt out of Facebook, it's a position of privilege. A lot of people can't.
Yeah, no,
and a lot of companies can't.
Exactly, and also me receiving an email which says that this is how we're doing is not in any way empowering me, because it's just telling me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, although what I will say is that he also said that there was an opt-out.
You have to contact them to opt out.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's the ideal system.
It's just, it's interesting. It's very.
It's a business model problem, though.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing that I think.
Exactly.
That's why I'm kind of. I think it's a really interesting challenge because on the one hand, you know, none of us in the entire population has to use Google or Facebook, right? But vast numbers of people do. Right, and you know there are alternatives. There are plenty of ways that you can get similar levels of information, and that you can potentially share information about your family news with your friends. You don't need to do that, and yet we all, well, actually, increasingly some of us don't. But you know, so that's on the one hand. There's that, right? So if we felt collectively as a community that we wanted to reject these things, then why is it that we can't get the community to do that? So that's one question on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think, you know, from and this is where our kind of program work is kind of interesting, and we feel very strongly about the value of this, is that there's got to be a business model that allows you to behave responsibly, right? Yeah. The trouble is that the only examples we've got of business models that use this stuff are ones where people don't behave responsibly. And not only are they examples, they're really, really big, really successful examples. I was talking to somebody in the break who said, well, we've just got to get a few bad apples out of the barrel, haven't we? The trouble is, it's not bad apples out of the barrel, it's most of the trees in the forest, right, that made the barrel. So that's the challenge, and that's why I think we've got to work on business models that can help.
But I think, to go back on the initial question is, it's important to have regulation. It's important to have those conversations. I think exactly, this type of event that we're having today are vital because it's mixing different industry. We all have different business we're running, and I think it's great to have those conversations and be completely frank about the issues. And to be honest, on the data point, last year, when we implemented all the GDPR, I think it was great that was finally coming. Of course, it was a huge pain point for a lot of companies in order to serve their user or making sure they were responsible. But these regulations are very important for us to be responsible in the way we are using the data and the data which are collected about users.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a sort of further point of that as well, is that, which I sort of struggle with a little bit, is that, and I agree with you about the business models and the challenges thereof. And I think that there's and again, I'm going to get in trouble for this, so please focus on the things you're going to yell at me for. But I think that there is currently an overemphasis on, and it's why I was so excited to see Sushana Shubov's work. I think there is an overemphasis exclusively on Facebook and Google, and an underemphasis on the advertising industry that drives a lot of this work, and the ad tech industry. And I think it's because they're sort of a known enemy of bad doing, right? But it's even interesting when you see articles that will cite both. Facebook is, that will cite, this is a sort of industry-wide advertising challenge. It's definitely at the moment Facebook that gets the press.
Yes, I think it's a huge. It's very interesting. Those are hero companies to me. It pains me sitting here saying, God, these are sort of, they're doing bad things. But I think,
and I think they absolutely
I don't think anyone individually within the company thinks that they are. It's just that the unintended consequences of their scale more than anything else.
And also that we don't, we failed to regulate advertising, and we're currently struggling to regulate.
Well, I think the other problem about regulation in this context is obviously these are global businesses. So what are we going to do? We're going to regulate our own citizens out of benefit as well as downside, in the interest of being some kind of model for the rest of the world. Is that I don't know. There's trade-offs in that, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to close that one there. Brilliant question. Well done. Look what you did there. Now, Louise, I think also Louise has got a couple. Why don't we take 3 questions at a time? Because I think we've got quite a few now coming in the audience. So what have you got, Louise?
So I'll take one from Slido. So if you're frustrated, stick your question on Slido. We can get it in that way. Particularly on that last point, the platforms we were just talking about, the big US platforms, rely on advertising pays model to sell personal data. Will we only get responsible technology if we pay for what we use? And then I will run the mic up to the back.
Okay, great question. One at the back. Have you got a microphone? No. Well, hang on. We're running up there. We've got one here. Okay.
I have a question specifically for Anab. You've written before about human-centered design, and the paradigm of human-centered design is probably quite important in terms of getting lots of services to be designed in a much better way for lots of people, but we're sort of now getting to a stage where maybe we need to go beyond that. And I'm thinking particularly about the public sector, where many services need radically improving to cater for so many different types of people, but you've also written about the sort of selfishness that might be at the heart of user-centered design, and I wonder if you could just speak about how we can go beyond that and what that actually looks like.
Right, well, you be thinking on that one. And I think we've got one. Have you got a microphone at the back?
Hi, I have a question that relates to. So I'm thinking about responsibility by thinking about the opposite. Sorry. Hello. I'm thinking about responsibility by trying to look at what the opposites are. So some questions of who do you think or what projects have been irresponsible? And the question relating to Facebook and individuals involved. Who do you think has been complicit, and what sacrifices do there needs to be made for us to be responsible?
Right, there are three great questions. Let's start at the beginning. So, the US models, do we have to move away from those kind of free, slightly hidden charges where you're actually giving something that you maybe don't value at the point that you were giving it, and suddenly you realise at a later date there was a huge value for it? Do we need to move towards paid-for models? Thoughts?
Well, there's some interesting things going on that are trying to respond to this at a technology level. So there are two browsers actually. One is called DuckDuckGo and the other one's called Brave. And if you don't know about them, you should check them out what they do is they basically prevent cookie collection, they prevent browser surveillance, they prevent those organizations that do then sell that data from being able to acquire any of that data. So, I think there are about 4 million people using DuckDuckGo now. I'm not sure the numbers for Brave. Brave has even a further model because they then look at, and they're using blockchain to kind of tokenize your willingness to pay attention to ads. So we pay attention. Actually, what they want is for our attention to have us paid, and they've reversed it. And that's an interesting place to start to go. And obviously, the more people who went that way, rather than using Chrome or other browsers are available. That could start to change some part of it. So it sort of starts to undermine one of those models and suggests a different model.
Yeah, I suppose there's the issue of scale. Is that
exactly
the ubiquitous models are there, and it's about word of mouth and starting to move towards different models. Ella, did you want to come in on that question?
Do I want to come in? I think so. I think there's something sort of I think my sort of worry about. I think subscription models will happen, and I think we'll sort of see increased ones, right? And I'm sort of like actively paying for our work. I think that thinking that they're going to solve so many of our problems is unlikely. I think my worry there is that we'll exacerbate this sort of multi-tier internet, right? Where if you don't have money, what you're being fed is trash with advertising. It's being tracked. You have no choices over it. And there's no incentive for the companies that are doing good to improve their data practices for the sort of less valuable consumers. So that's one of the things that worries me. And I think that's, these are the tricky questions, and I think that it's a very elegant solution, which indicates to me that it's not accurate.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not a mathematician, so I like to problematize.
We've got lots of questions coming in. Anyway, did you want to? Is there a quick answer to the, or is that one for lunch?
Probably. I just want to say one thing, that that's a really good question, where I think about it at a meta level, that we tend to think of ourselves at the center of the universe, and a lot of these problems we talk about are very entrenched within the economic paradigm that we live in, and that if we have the courage to think of an alternate economic paradigm which does not incentivize a certain kind of economic growth, then we can start thinking of these problems as in a more interconnected way. And I appreciate the fact that we are not at the center of the universe, and therefore this human-centered design must actually be more than human-centered design, and must include those who we live with and whom we depend on, which may not be considered human. That's a short answer. Maybe we can talk over lunch.
And I mean, we could spend some time debating those projects that are irresponsible. I kind of feel that isn't necessarily going to get us to a great place this morning. But could we actually, there was a great question that came up there that said...
Well, essentially, there's one example. I'll just give you one example, just because because part of what's coming up here is actually what's the consumer role in all this, right? And so there was this app that apparently did you this brilliant favor of unsubscribing you from all these subscription services that you'd sort of signed up to, right? Except that in order to do that, what it did was it scanned your entire inbox of email and then reported back to its clients, one of whom turned out to be Uber, about all of the times that you'd used their particular product, i.e. you'd used or not used Uber, or maybe you'd used a competitor to Uber, but they didn't tell you about that bit, and it was free. So, there's no such thing as a free lunch on the internet.
No, the thing is, the main issue is like, as a consumer, you are not really aware of what usage is made on your data, and I think that's a real concern, and that's why I think it's very important for company to be ethical in the way they approach the data usage. And it's all of us as business owners or responsible of business or working company to make sure what we will find fair for us is what we want for our community, and that's something we're really striving for at Hi-Rez. We need our community. Without our community, we have no business. So we are very careful in the way we are using data, and we are asking a lot to our partners as well.
So we're coming up to the last 5 minutes of this. I'm going to ask each of you if you've got a message for the audience. But before we do that, can I just check? We were talking there about this, the subscription model thing. If you would use or would pay for a service rather than have the free service, how many of you today are using, for example, DuckDuckGo or a paid-for service? Okay, reasonable number. And how many of you maybe might think about using it, having heard Jeremy talking about it today? A lot more. Okay, I should be better. I should be more like the man from Bulb and actually be able to do percentages. Yeah, exactly. I would say maybe 50% in the audience there. So all the panel are going to be here afterwards as well over lunch. So the questions that we haven't got to, we can come back to. Yeah. Do you want your closing thoughts?
I guess my closing thoughts is that it's easy to be really all doom and gloom about this stuff. And obviously there's reason for concern. I think there's something really exciting to see, even outside this room, sort of greater understanding and knowledge about these issues and how they impact us. And I think the thing is that, from like Mark Fisher's sort of capitalist realism, given that this is a system we live in today, doing bad needs to be bad business. And part of that is voting with your feet or with your click.
Yeah. For my view is there are positive things, and we're doing a lot of good with the usage of AI and bots in the game world. And just something very simple is we are actually using AI control character to give to our players, so like that they have more fun. Because sometimes it's very hard to defeat a real person, but when you're not really good, or it's easier to defeat the AI. And basically what we're doing is we scale the level of intelligence or performance of the AI based on who you are. And I think that's quite fun because what we're trying to do is create fun content for our users. So that's a positive way.
For me, the elephant in the room is the economic model that we live in. And as Jeremy said, we need to think about alternate economic models if we really want to think about this as a long game rather than short fixes.
Jeremy?
I think I agree with that. I think we need to encourage businesses to continue to innovate and develop new models, and we have to educate consumers as well.
Yeah.
And for me, I think that point on educating consumers, I think, my closing reflection would be, there's two things that really struck me. One was the point about the divide that can come from subscription models, and actually that's true on so many levels. It's not just about subscription models. I'm really taken, I spend a lot of time with senior executives from the big tech companies, and when I do a lot of work around young people, and when I hear them talking about the controls they put in their own families, both, they are very different to perhaps controls that are, being used by the status quo, people who are perhaps not as au fait with how some of the technology works, or perhaps some of the detriment, and that divide worries me as well. So I think there's another angle there. But I think you nailed it for me, actually, that piece where you said, actually, from a consumer perspective, we all need to recognise there's actually nothing, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So somebody's always making it, and therefore you've got to be looking at what you're buying, but hopefully going forward, as we're choosing the organisations that we want to walk towards, we will be walking towards organisations like Bulb, who are, making very conscious choices about the business model they want to do, and perhaps away from organisations that perhaps have less ethical kind of constructs at the heart of their business. So that would be my take on that. Thanks. Thank you. You were great. You challenged them, and thank you to you. Big hand for our panel, please.